So what brings me here is that I got arrested. Some of you know this already, and it was the fact that I got arrested that prompted Ken to suggest I come and talk about this. And what I want to do is talk to you about why I got arrested. And the way I want to talk to you about why I got arrested is by giving you the talk that persuaded me that I needed to get arrested. And persuaded more than 1,000 other people too that they needed to get arrested. So, this is going to be a talk in large part about climate change. And when we talk about climate change, we're often encouraged to be optimistic, to focus on the positive stories of it. And that can be really powerful, that can be very galvanizing. But it also comes, I think, with a real risk that we never face up to the reality that we are actually in. And instead, we generate a false sense of security. So I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to take a step back and be guided by one of the core Extinction Rebellion principles of telling the truth and acting like the truth is real. And this isn't an easy thing to do. You might find yourself feeling sad or angry, and those feelings are appropriate, I think, and they're rational, I think. And I encourage you not to turn away from them, but to sit with the feelings and to face up to them. It's an important part of what this talk does. I don't think I need to warn you, but this isn't really a talk that's suitable for young children. So if you identify as a young child, I would suggest that you might want to think again about sticking around. But if you are staying, I'd really appreciate it if you could stay for the whole thing. This talk has two very distinct parts, and each part matters. I will make the slides available to anybody who wants them. They'll be freely available online anyway, but it'll be difficult to get to the address. And I will also make the references for everything I say available. So our starting place is climate change. In particular, the heating of the planet as a result of anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, most conspicuously carbon dioxide. And this issue is standardly framed around the conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. As you probably know, the IPCC most recently issued this report on the impact of global heating of 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, and on the impact of 2 degrees Celsius of warming as compared to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And pre-industrial levels means here the levels as of 1850 or so. And bear in mind that by 1850 the Industrial Revolution was well underway. So the IPCC's conclusions were stark. In 2018, this report was issued. The IPCC told us that impacts can be expected to be much worse at 2 degrees, and therefore that we must keep to 1.5 degrees. But it also said that 1.5 degrees is far from safe. We can still expect at 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels severe impact. The severe impacts the IPCC describes include that hundreds of millions more people than now will be exposed to water scarcity, flooding, drought, wildfires, deadly heat waves, rising sea levels, and storms. Moreover, we can expect that we will lose key coastal ecosystems, marine species, and fisheries, and we will see heat-related, ozone, and undernutrition deaths. As a result, we will also see great political instability and migration crises. At 2 degrees Celsius, as compared to 1.5 degrees Celsius, these risks will be greatly increased, and further hundreds of millions of people will be exposed to them. We can also expect complete and irreversible destruction of key ecosystems and species, widespread food insecurity that hinders further mitigation of climate change-related ecosystem damage, major political destabilization around the globe, and a sharp increase in extinction rates. The publishers and the authors of this report were not particularly relaxed about these conclusions. So Eric Solheim on the right said, "The world has just over a decade to get climate change under control." Sorry, he said it's like a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We have to put out the fire. And Deborah Roberts said, "It's a line in the sand, and what it says to our species is that this is the moment and we must act now. The next few years are probably the most important in our history." That was last year. So according to the IPCC, even to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, with all the chaos and the suffering associated with that degree of warming, we need to make radical changes now. We have to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 45% from 2010 levels in the next 11 years. We have to cut them to zero by 2050. And this will require, they say, radical transformation of energy, industry, transport, building, agriculture, forestry, and land use. What we're doing now is not enough. As the report's authors say, if current pledges for 2030 are achieved but no more, researchers find few, if any, ways to reduce emissions after 2030 sufficiently quickly to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Where are we now? Well, we're already at about 1 degree above pre-industrial levels. Greenhouse gas emissions are already having an effect on the global mean surface temperature. So 1.5 degrees Celsius, with all the attendant chaos, with all the attendant suffering, that's not far away. We need to act now. So this stuff you probably already know. Here's the emissions trajectory that the IPCC says we need if we're to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 1850. So I don't know if you see P1 to P4 on the right. They represent 4 illustrative ways of doing that. P1 and P2, the ones near the top, they represent low demand and sustainability routes in which we drastically reduce our resource and energy consumption via efficiency or via reductions in demand. P4 at the bottom, that represents a fossil fuel intensive and high energy demand route. And P3 is a middle of the road scenario. As you can see from this graph, it's pretty clear, the more resource and energy intensive pathways require us to have negative emissions to a great degree. They all in fact require us to have negative emissions, but the fossil fuel intensive one, the energy intensive one, requires us to have negative emissions starting in about 2050. You should note that prospective pathways are considered 1.5 degree pathways, according to the IPCC, if, based on current knowledge, the majority of available approaches assign an approximate probability of 1 in 2 to 2 in 3 to temperatures either remaining 1.5 degrees or returning to 1.5, either before or around 2100. That's just half and half to 2/3 probability of sticking to 1.5, even if we follow these. So that's what's required. So far, so reasonably well known. Here's how we're doing. Here's our current emissions trajectory based on the most recent data. Emissions are increasing every year, and moreover, they're increasing at an increasing rate. So you might ask, what exactly does this mean for the future? Let me tell you a bit about that. The black line here gives you global emissions so far. So that's historical emissions on the left. Suppose that we wave a magic wand right now and stopped all our emissions immediately. Now, warming wouldn't stop immediately, in the same way that when you stop your car by pressing the brake pedal, that doesn't stop the car immediately. There's locked-in warming, and so we will see some additional warming, and that's what's shown by the increasing trend upwards on the yellow and green lines before they start dipping. But that takes us, if we stop right now, that takes us to about 1.3 to 1.7 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. But of course this is a magic wand, we don't have a magic wand, so let's instead imagine that we don't do that, but we do keep all the promises we've made around the world to tackle climate change, including those made so far under the Paris Agreement on climate change, which don't incidentally achieve the explicit Paris target of limiting 2 degrees Celsius, let alone the Paris ideal of 1.5. They take us, in fact, to around 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So that's double the line in the sand that the IPCC has drawn for us. At this level, we see more or less complete loss of coral reefs, loss of summer Arctic sea ice, severe to extreme impacts in terms of extreme events, crop failure, inland flooding, coastal flooding, heat-related mortality, impacts on fisheries, and high risk of abrupt and irreversible impacts. Finally, though, that's just things going reasonably well according to current rules. But how we're actually doing is indicated by the red. So that represents global heating if we carry on behaving as we are behaving today, business as usual. That leads to 4 degrees of warming or more by the end of the century. And this is beyond catastrophic. This is something we don't really understand and can't really quantify in terms of the impacts. It isn't systematically analysed in the IPCC reports because it involves just so many unknowns. Everything I've said so far has just been based on these IPCC reports. But because the IPCC reports are so politically important, they have to stand at the far end of the spectrum that's before you. A scientist's opinion down the pub has not been subjected to peer review. A peer-reviewed paper reflects a bit more consensus and a bit more rigour in the assessment of the evidence. But it still falls short of something like a review of a specific area of science, of all the peer-reviewed work in that area. And so the further along the spectrum you go, the better the conclusions that you read reflect consensus about the evidence. They don't necessarily better reflect truth, but they reflect better our consensus about the evidence. So when we talk about the IPCC's conclusions then, we're really talking about something that's very mainstream accepted science. But at the same time, and you may have heard the figure, 97% of scientists accept that climate change is anthropogenic and so forth. But at the same time, the conclusions of the IPCC are also the conclusions that even the most cautious and reticent members of the set of authors who wrote these reports are prepared to stand behind. So as well as being very rigorous, the conclusions may tend in some cases to be, in some senses, conservative. And I want to introduce you to a few of those ways. Here are some particular ways in which they may tend towards the conservative. The last three in particular are not independent of each other, though I don't want to suggest that they are, but they're nevertheless distinct ways of being conservative. So, in the first place, the IPCC's predictions and prescriptions reflect, or assume rather, untested carbon capture and storage technology. So it's not that the carbon capture and storage technology has never been tested, it's that it's never been tested or shown to work at scale. And the IPCC acknowledges this and says, this will have to happen, but it's never been shown that it can happen. Moreover, the summary for policymakers, which is the IPCC report is a huge document, and policymakers mostly read only the summary for policymakers of the document. It's a much shorter document at the very start. That document is gone through line by diplomats, not by scientists, or as well as by scientists, and it's subject to approval by diplomats. They get to determine what's in it. And you can imagine that the diplomats aren't always solely concerned with the truth, although I'm sure they are very concerned with the truth, since some of the things in the policy for summary for policymakers are going to have implications for which country should do what. Moreover, and necessarily, a report like this, a huge report which reflects many years of work on the part of its authors, relies on outdated research. It has to. The research it relies on has been published, and already research, by the time the report comes out, already there's research that supersedes it. The IPCC has a history, as a result, of making some excessively conservative estimates in ways I'll show you. And its projections and its prescriptions, moreover, do not take into account a range of possible feedback loops. So because of these, there's this risk that the IPCC's projections and prescriptions understate things. Let me give you a simple illustration. This animation shows the change in sea ice in the Arctic over 20 years. So the bright and white is thicker ice, and this animation, and older ice as well, and this animation begins in 2000, before which there's been a steady decline in the extent of the sea ice. And it was expected that the steady decline would continue, but instead you can see that as we approach present day, the area of thick, longer-lived ice very rapidly shrinks, and we quite suddenly lose a large proportion of the remaining white area in just a few years. So that was not predicted, not originally. And this graph shows you how the observations and the predictions from early IPCC models diverged. Why were the predictions off? Well, this takes us to the point about feedback loops. Earlier models didn't factor in various feedback loops that turned out to affect how the climate develops. So here's an example of such a feedback loop, the albedo effect. So we all understand intuitively, I think, relatively intuitively, the albedo effect. We all wear white t-shirts in hot weather, right? Or in sunny weather, more accurately. What does this have to do with climate feedbacks? Well, as the climate warms, that melts sea ice. And what that does is replace a bright white reflective surface with the dark absorbent surface of the sea. As a result, we get more warming and more ice melts, which of course increases the dark surface size still further, and so on. And so that's understood to be what explains this kind of sort of non-linear decline in sea ice, or one of the factors. And this is an example of a feedback loop which is relatively well understood. But there are lots of other feedback loops that we don't have such a good understanding of. Here's one. Forest carbon sinks. Forests and other ecosystems naturally soak up carbon and slow down climate change as a result. The Amazon rainforest, for example, is the largest such carbon sink in the world. But climate change weakens forests' ability to do that for us, or for anyone. For example, where climate change creates warmer, drier conditions, the trees become more stressed, and they also become more vulnerable as a result to insects that thrive in the warmer, drier conditions that we're creating. The drier forests are also more prone to wildfires, and they're less able to foster the wet conditions in which they thrive. It turns out that if a big enough forest generates its own rain. As a result of these attacks and these wildfires, the trees die, which releases more carbon, which of course contributes to making the forest drier yet, and so on. The image on the left illustrates this. It shows a forest in British Columbia. All the red coloration is trees that were killed by an outbreak of a single species of beetle, which flourished in the drier conditions of the warming planet, or in that area. This single outbreak, the single outbreak that caused the reddening trees there, that caused more CO2 emissions than 40 years of wildfires across Canada. Another example, not very well illustrated by the pictures on the right, is dieback of Arctic plant communities. So this is something that's also linked to climate change. It's happening more and more often, and it's weakening the Arctic carbon sink. But until a few years ago, we didn't even know this was happening. So the result of all this is that the relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and temperature is not likely to be linear. But trying to build these processes into our predictions of the future is very, very difficult. Not all feedback loops of this sort are accounted for in our predictions. And there are many possible feedback loops. This image just shows you some of them. And the IPCC does offer estimates about the likelihood of some of these feedback loops being triggered. It says that even at the temperature ranges that we're supposedly aiming for, there is a moderate risk of tipping points, including relating to sea level rise. But others it sets aside because it's just too uncertain how and by what levels of global warming they will be triggered. Yet in some scenarios, some of these feedback loops get triggered, and that triggers others. And this gives rise to the possibility of a tipping cascade, and with it, runaway global warming. One paper, fairly recently published on this, says, beyond the threshold, positive reinforcing feedbacks within the Earth system, outside of human influence or control, could become the dominant driver of the system's pathway. So at that point, if that happens, that's it for us. We lose control. We can't do anything about it with our own emissions reductions. In addition to all these processes, which aren't very well understood but are at least identified, there are of course complete unknowns. So here's an example. This paper was published earlier this year. It's looking at quite an extreme scenario, business as usual in emissions for about another century, or at least one hopes that's extreme. It finds that carbon dioxide gets so high that large expanses of cloud disperse quite abruptly. And that adds 8 degrees of warming on top of the warming we'd expect to see due to emissions by now. I'm not sharing this with you because I think we should all expect that 8 degrees of warming. I'm sharing it with you because I think it's an important reminder that as we create this increasingly unfamiliar world, there are going to be surprises. And as this scientist, a paleoclimatologist at Purdue University, as he says, these are not all going to be pleasant surprises. To be confident of avoiding catastrophic results, we need to cut greenhouse gases even more drastically than the IPCC says. We can't afford to use the conventional fossil fuels we've discovered, let alone look for others as we're currently doing. So let's remind ourselves of our current trajectory. More than 4 degrees Celsius of warming relative to 1850 levels. And note that this projection doesn't take into account all the possible further warming associated with the feedback loops, or therefore fully account for the possibility of tipping cascades. In other words, we're taking huge, huge risks. As the founding director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and a senior climate advisor of the EU put it, climate change is now reaching the endgame, where very soon humanity must choose between taking unprecedented action or accepting that it has been too late left too late to bear the consequences. This is all numbers, right? You've heard statistics. You've had these things, they've been thrown at you for decades now, and somehow they're not quite hitting home. So let me try and make it a little bit more concrete by giving you some examples of the sorts of impacts we're talking about. One impact, a familiar one, is in the form of sea level rise. According to one recent analysis, based on the median sea level projections, not the maximum, 2 degrees Celsius of warming submerges land home in 2010 to more than 250 million people globally. At 4 degrees Celsius, it's almost 2/3 of a billion, and that includes 10% of the UK population. Moreover, once floods from storm surges and the like are factored in, things look a lot worse. According to one study, under the IPCC's, one of its reports, intermediate mitigation pathways, not the ones I showed you, but from an earlier report, at many sites, what is currently a 100-year event will statistically occur at least once per year in 2050. I should say by 2050. Another impact is in the form of drought. The IPCC suggests that the extra 0.5 degrees Celsius between 1.5 and 2 alone will lead to strong increases in the probability of dryness and reduced water availability in the Mediterranean region, including South Europe, Northern Africa and the Near East, and in Southern Africa and in the Middle East. And as the IPCC notes, many historical periods of turmoil have coincided with severe droughts, including periods of civilizational collapse. And even as drier areas dry out further with increased global heating, so other areas are predicted to become increasingly wet, with increases in the intensity and frequency of rainfall extremes associated flooding. Another impact is in the form of extreme events such as cyclones, typhoons, hurricanes, and associated destruction. Again, at 3 degrees Celsius and beyond, the IPCC predicts increases in the number of the most intense cyclones. And of course, all this is likely to produce mass migration of people, not only as a result of the sea level rises, the droughts, the precipitation, the cyclones themselves, but also as a result of the crop failures, the famine, the political instability, and the war that can be expected to accompany them. According to the UN International Organization for Migration, future forecasts vary from 25 million to 1 billion environmental migrants by 2050, moving either within their countries or across borders on a permanent or temporary basis, with 200 million being the most widely cited estimate. This figure equals the current estimate of international migrants worldwide. Unless you rest easy, this is not all in the future. This is a screenshot of, I think, the BBC homepage in June 2018. Global hunger is increasing, and the UN attributes climate change and climate-related shocks as a key driver. We're already losing land to desertification. Scientists are attributing extreme events worldwide to climate change. The UN International Organization for Migration says it's evident that gradual and sudden environmental changes are both already resulting in substantial population movements. The number of storms, droughts and floods has increased threefold over the past 30 years, with devastating effects on vulnerable communities, particularly in the developing world. In 2008, 20 million persons were displaced by extreme weather events, compared to 4.6 million internally displaced by conflict and violence. That's 4 times as many as by war over the same period. Gradual changes in the environment tend to have an even greater impact on the movement of people than extreme events. For instance, over the last 30 years, twice as many people have been affected by droughts as by storms, 1.6 billion compared to approximately 718 million. But this is, again, not just about the numbers, it's about the human cost. The human cost of forced migration is enormous. And often this cost is borne, of course, by people in the global south, people of colour, women, children, people whose voices we are least likely to hear, or maybe better, least likely to listen to. Let me give you an example of such a voice. This is Shamizur Ghazi, an 83-year-old Bangladeshi speaking. Climate change has wrecked everything. Our people are living in other towns and cities like refugees. All I wanted was to grow old with my children and their children, but now they are gone, and I don't think they will ever return. And yet Ghazi is in some ways one of the lucky ones. On the 2nd of May 2008, Min Ai, her husband and their 2 daughters, aged 3 and 6, took their boat to a nearby island to buy wood. The family lived from selling timber in Bogali and other towns. The family planned to sleep in the boat. They saw nothing unusual in the wind, which gathered steadily through the afternoon. But by 9 p.m. it had reached a force so frightening that they abandoned their small craft for the shore and scuttled into the first house they could find. Some 25 others were already cowering there. As the cyclone approached, It drove massive waves up the vast tidal rivers that drain the Irrawaddy Delta in the Indian Ocean, into the Indian Ocean. The floodwater surged over the island where Mien Mien Ai's family were marooned, and it tore the house from its stilt legs and drove its collapsing structure into a nearby haystack. She said, "I couldn't see anything. All I know is that people were grabbing the haystack and trying to hold on to each other as the water pulled at us. My husband and I held hands, and we each held one of the children. Cast into the water, the couple grabbed the branches of a tree, only to be swallowed up by the drifting haystack. Mien Mien Ai lost her husband's hand forever." Minutes later, she says, the realization crept over her that life was slipping from her 3-year-old daughter, who was still in her grasp. Stricken by grief, she gave herself up to the current, preferring to hold the tiny body of her daughter, rather than to save herself. "Although I knew that my little daughter was dead," she said, "I told myself I would never let her go." The wind and the water had been too much for her, and she became limp as a piece of cloth. Mien Mien Ai says that she slipped in and out of consciousness until fortune saw her washed up on another island. Bits of wood were piling up on top of me, and I was stuck beneath them. I struggled to get out, and I realized I had let go of the child. I tried to grab her again, but I could find only her leg. Then another wave hit us, and because her body was so slippery, I lost her. That's what we're talking about right now. You hear a lot about emissions and climate change. I don't think the facts about those things are really, truly, vividly present to most people's minds much of the time. I don't believe the truth is really understood here. But it's not only through greenhouse gas emissions that we change the world in unprecedented ways. Let me give you two important ideas: ecosystems and biodiversity. Those are words you'll have heard a lot. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms interacting with their non-living environment as a distinct system, linked by nutrient and energy flows. Biodiversity is a measure of the variety of life at genetic species and also at ecosystem levels. As a recent report released just last month by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services highlights, we are massively, massively dependent on ecosystems and biodiversity for food, for fresh water, for wood, for materials, for fuel, for climate regulation, for flood regulation, for disease regulation. So just to give you a couple of more specific details of that kind of example, wetlands and rainforests and rivers are what purify and distribute water for us. Soil health, marine health and pollinators are essential for food production. 75% of all crops rely on animal pollinators. Biodiversity is a key source of medicine too, around 70% of new small molecule drugs, which is the majority of new drug candidates, that have been approved in the 30 years up to 2010, based on a natural source. So natural products play a dominant role in the discovery of leads for the development of drugs and the treatment of human diseases. You can see from this infographic many other ways in which we're dependent on ecosystems and biodiversity. It's not going to be a surprise to you to learn that we are destroying ecosystems and reducing biodiversity at a rate unprecedented in human history. Pesticide and fertilizer use, land conversion, monoculture, pollution, deforestation, water use, biological invasion and disease, tourism, mining and war are among the key non-emissions related drivers. Each year, humanity's resource consumption exceeds the Earth's capacity to regenerate the resources in a year. And the day upon which this happens is getting earlier and earlier. This graph illustrates the point, showing what's known as Earth Overshoot Day. As you can see, it's getting earlier and earlier. You can decompose it, if you like, into overshoot days for particular states. So Vietnam's overshoot day is the 21st of December. The UK's is the 8th of May. Qatar's is the 9th of February. In short, we're spending more than we can afford every year, and we're spending more than we can afford to buy more every year. Let me give you some examples of the destruction that we're wreaking, so as to give you a sense of the scale and the speed. What this graph shows is that humans have wiped out 60% of vertebrates since 1970. More precisely, it shows average abundance of 16 or nearly 17,000 populations, which represent 4,000 species monitored across the globe, declined by 60%. To put that in perspective, if we did this to human populations, that would be equivalent to emptying North America, South America, Africa, Europe, China, and Oceania. That's the scale of what we've done in just 50 years. Humans have converted 51% of the Earth's land cover from forest and grassland to crops, cities and grazing. 75% of the Earth's land is significantly altered. It'll be 90% if we carry on at the current rates by 2050. Global forest area has shrunk by 40%. Forests have virtually disappeared altogether in 25 countries. And there's more. 85% of the Earth's wetlands have been lost now. 50% of the Earth's coral cover has been lost since the 1870s. Humans have altered the oceans through fishing, land and sea-based pollution, and aquaculture and development. 66% of the Earth's ocean area is affected. The biomass of wild animals, that's just the sheer mass of animal, is down by 82%. Insect populations are in massive decline, with 40% estimated to be at risk of extinction within the next few decades. One German study revealed a 76% decline in insect biomass over 27 years. It's estimated that it will take about 5 to 7 million years for mammal diversity to recover. Here's another vivid illustration of the changes we've been making. Remember that the Amazon is the world's biggest carbon sink, and that also that the terrestrial ecosystem, it's the terrestrial ecosystem that exhibits the most biodiversity. These maps show the extent of the rainforest in the Amazon and in Borneo a few decades ago. Already, quite a lot of rainforest have been destroyed by them, just to be clear. And now here it is, 2017, 2010. The red area shows what's been lost. And you know, I guess, that Bolsonaro in Brazil is not slowing this. Here are the trends in global pesticide use, taken from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. As you see, it's climbing steeply in the case of pesticide use, climbing as well in the case of fertilizer use. And even as we're wreaking all of this destruction, the world's human population is expected to grow by 2.2 billion, that's 29%, to 9.8 billion by 2050. So global food demand is expected to grow by more, by 39%. So you can see which way things are heading. Ecosystems and biodiversity are really important protectors against climate change. They provide important carbon sinks, for example, as we've seen. But even if we reduced our greenhouse gas emissions to zero tomorrow, we'd still have a huge problem, because we're extracting resources at an utterly unsustainable rate. This brings me to the question of extinction, the title of this talk. So species are going extinct all the time. The mere fact of things going extinct might be tragic in the case of some species, but it's not in itself terrible. There's a background rate of extinction, and normally this is compensated for by speciation, which is the development of new species. But during what's called a mass extinction event, the extinction rate spikes without a corresponding increase in the speciation rate. And guess what? The current extinction rate is estimated to be between 100 and 10,000 times the normal background rate, and there's no corresponding increase in the speciation rate. This isn't really a surprise. Let me explain. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the Earth's history, including the one that you all know about, which killed off the dinosaurs. Common features of those 5 extinctions are as follows. They have unusual climate dynamics. So, for example, there are rapid changes in the climate or rapid changes in sea level. There are changes in atmospheric composition. So there's increased carbon dioxide or decreased oxygen, for example. And there are abnormally high intensity ecological stresses, so habitat loss or disease, for example. And of course, all of these features are present now, as these graphs help to illustrate. Temperatures, sea levels, and ocean heat content are changing rapidly. Says the IPCC, warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and the ocean have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, and sea levels have risen. Greenhouse gas concentrations and warming are, and I quote from a recent study in Science, the journal Science, unfolding at a rate that is at least an order of magnitude and potentially several orders of magnitude more rapid than the changes to which terrestrial ecosystems have been exposed during the past 65 million years. And here's the IPCC on atmospheric composition. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have led to atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that are unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. For context, I didn't know that humans in modern form have been on Earth for only 200,000 years, and civilization as we know it has been around for about 6,000 years. So this is not something we've experienced. We've not gone through this. And meanwhile, as the author of a landmark, of the landmark IPBES report that I told you about earlier says, ecosystems, species, wild populations, local varieties and breeds of domesticated plants and animals are shrinking, deteriorating or vanishing. The essential interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frail. The conclusion, as a recent paper in Nature put it, is that the Earth's sixth mass extinction has already arrived, and we are causing it. So this is about loss of species and populations, of course, of biodiversity and ecosystems. But it's also about loss of abundance, of sheer numbers. And this can be really hard to see because our baselines shift with each generation. Each generation thinks the amount of nature it sees is normal, is the normal amount. And so it might help to make what's going on a bit more vivid if I quote you a passage from Michael McCarthy's book, The Moth Snowstorm. So in this book, McCarthy describes his first encounter with the buddleia as a child in England in the 1950s. The plant, which is an ordinary suburban buddleia, the sort of buddleia that I take it you've all seen many times, was, he says, crawling with butterflies, absolutely crawling with them. And this abundance was part of its fascination for him, a fascination that gave rise to a lifelong love of the natural world. Writing about his childhood, he says, "This is not childhood seen through rose-tinted binoculars. I remember it clearly. It was somehow at the heart of the attraction. I don't think I could have been affected in the same way by a solitary red admiral, marvel of creation though it is. There were lots of many things then. Suburban gardens were thronged with thrushes, hares galumphing across every pasture, mayflies hatched on springtime rivers in dazzling swarms, and larks filled the air, and poppies filled the fields, and if butterflies filled the summer days, the moths filled the summer nights. And sometimes the moths were in such numbers that they would pack a car's headlight beams like snowflakes in a blizzard. There would be a veritable snowstorm of moths. And at the end of your journey, you would have to wash your windscreen. You would have to sponge away the sheer, astounding richness of life." That was in the 1950s. 30 years later, when I was a child in the 80s, we had a buddleia in our garden too. And I too associate it with butterflies. It would sometimes have 6, 7, 8, 9 on it. It was never crawling with them. And another 30 years later, I have a buddleia in my garden now. If I even see 2 butterflies on it, everyone in the family comes out to look. The moth snowstorm that McCarthy describes, I have never seen. Nor the hares, nor the thrushes, nor the moths. The idea of being a collector of butterflies, as so many children were in the middle of the 20th century, that seems quixotic now. Who's going to do that? Football stickers or beanie babies, they're the rational object of a child collector's impulse now. These problems of climate change and ecosystem collapse and extinction, they're not independent of one another. Climate change and biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, they're mutually reinforcing. In a way, they represent one big giant feedback loop. Global annual emissions and rates of biodiversity ecosystem loss are currently both rising, as we've said. To quote again from the science paper I mentioned, the trajectories of the human population, energy demand, economic development, and climate policy therefore create the very real possibility that over the coming century, atmospheric CO2 concentrations will be the highest of the past 22 million years, not just 800,000. As we saw, we're on track for 4 degrees Celsius or more of global warming, even not taking into account all these possible tipping cascades or the contributions of ecosystem destruction and biodiversity loss. So we may be on course for much, much worse once tipping points and ecosystems and biodiversity are factored in. And let me remind you, lest you've forgotten, of the 2018 IPCC report's conclusion. Even a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures is a disaster. Hundreds of millions more people exposed to water scarcity, flooding, drought, wildfires, heat waves, deadly heat waves, sea levels and storms. High risk of loss of key coastal ecosystems, marine species and fisheries. Loss of more than half their range for thousands of species. Heat-related ozone and undernutrition deaths, associated political instability and migration crises. That's just 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we're nowhere near that. And again, we hear statistics like this all the time, but we don't always face up to what they mean. We're talking about migration crises many times more severe and lasting than the Syrian migrant crisis of 2015, with its harrowing images of Island Kurdi. There will be many Island Kurdi. We're talking about war and famine. For illustration, here's a description of the 1930s famine in the Ukraine from Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, the book Bloodlands. In Ukraine cities, he says, hundreds of thousands of people waited each day for a simple loaf of bread. In Kharkiv, the republic's capital, we saw a new sort of misery. People appeared at 2 o'clock in the morning to queue in front of shops that did not open until 7. On an average day, 40,000 people would wait for bread. Those in line were so desperate to keep their places that they would cling to the belts of those immediately in front of them. Some were so weak from hunger that they could not stand without the ballast of strangers. The waiting lasted all day, and sometimes for 2. Pregnant women and maimed war veterans had lost their right to buy out of turn, and they had to wait in line with the rest if they wanted to eat. Somewhere in lines, a woman would wail, and the moaning would echo up and down the line, so that the whole group of thousands sounded like a single animal with an elemental fear. Survival was a moral as well as a physical struggle. A woman doctor wrote to a friend in June 1933 that she had not yet become a cannibal, but was not sure that I shall not be one by the time my letter reaches you. The good people died first. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow man died. Parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children did. Ukraine in 1933 was full of orphans. And sometimes people took them in. Yet without food there was little that even the kindest of strangers could do for such children. The boys and girls lay about on sheets and blankets, eating their own excrement, waiting for death. This is what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about when we talk about climate disaster and ecological crisis. Even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, this is what we're talking about. At 4 degrees Celsius and beyond, we're talking about the collapse of civilization. One recent study estimated a 5% chance of 5 degrees plus of global warming on current trajectories. That's 1 in 20. As its author asked, how many of us would choose to buckle our grandchildren into an airplane seat if we knew there was as much as a 1 in 20 chance of the airplane crashing? But with climate change that can pose existential threats, we have already put them on that plane. So I want to take a minute now to let this sink in. So the challenge here is not to understand the facts. We've all heard these facts before, but we don't think about them once we've heard them. We turn back to our everyday lives. The challenge is really to see this stuff and to feel an appropriate emotional and practical response. The response of turning away, of trying not to think about it, that's not appropriate. So I want you to try and feel the enormity of this. Please try to take in these facts. Since many of you are academically minded, I'm sure you spotted things where there are errors, but the mass of this stuff adds up to something that I want you to take into account properly and feel. While you're doing so, you can look at these pictures of animals that nobody on Earth will see again. Those are recently extinct, you can tell from the colour photos. So what's the proper response? I'm saying please feel the proper response, but what is the proper response to this emergency? So let's start with a reminder of what the IPCC says is needed in the next 11 years, as of 2019. Radical transformation of energy, industry, transport, building, agriculture, forestry, and land use, bringing about massive cuts in emissions. But please remember this was just for a 50 to 66% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius according to the majority of available approaches. And also please remember that the IPCC projections don't take into account all of the possible feedback loops, all of the ecosystem destruction, all of the biodiversity loss. And remember also that the IPCC projections do assume an as yet non-existent large-scale negative emissions technology. And many of the projection models that are used as the basis for this graph, especially the ones with the high emission scenarios, assume a vast amount of bioenergy alongside that carbon capture storage, well beyond anything that is remotely realistic, even setting aside the fact that we can't do the carbon capture and storage on a commercial scale yet. We're talking about scenarios that would require growing bioenergy crops on an area of land more than twice the size of India. So that's all of those assumptions and all of those emissions are built into these models, and yet these models require massive, drastic cuts anyway. Once we take the possibility of tipping cascades and current rates of ecosystem destruction and biodiversity loss and the lack of carbon capture and storage technology that's available and the amount of bioenergy crops that we need to be growing in order to hit the IPCC pathways, and the fact that even then that would give us just a 50 to 66% probability of staying under 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to start thinking more radically than the IPCC. Reduction of carbon emissions to zero within the next decade is what's required, not by 2050. We need immediate deep cuts in energy demand, for example through carbon rationing, through stringent efficiency standards, through frequent flyer levies, through building standards upgrades, through retrofitting. We need massive investment in these negative emissions technologies. We've got to take our chance and try and do that. We need an overhaul of transport. We need high-speed electrified railways, new public transport options, car-free cities, a moratorium on airport expansion. We need an overhaul of agriculture. We need localized resilient farming with limits on livestock production and phase out of factory farming. We need restoration of ecosystems, conservation and ocean protection programs to halt the ongoing mass extinction and to turn ecosystems into effective carbon sinks. Isn't this impossible? No. It would be a World War II style mass mobilization, to be sure, but there has been a World War II style mass mobilization before, in World War II. The UK's economy was transformed during World War II in order to win war. By 1943, 55% of national expenditure was directly on the war effort. From 1939 to 1942, imports of animal feedstuffs fell by 94%, butter by 69%, sugar by 66%, and wheat by 33%. From 1938 to 1941, that's just in 3 years, annual aircraft production rose from 2,828 to more than 20,000. So these sorts of changes are not materially impossible. The World War II mass mobilization, of course, wasn't the result of a very democratic process, and that's something I'll come back to in a moment. But this narrative of the wartime national ethos, that's a very powerful one in this country at least. It includes ideals of solidarity, a sense of genuinely being all in this together, with one aim clearly communicated. It includes a sense of equality, a sense of equal threat to everyone, and equal contributions, equal rations for everyone. And it includes a shared sense of an appeal to the greater good, to the responsibilities we have to our forebears and the responsibilities we have to those who are coming after us. You might ask, aren't governments doing what's necessary already? The answer is no. Remember these graphs which show the ever-rising rate of global fossil fuel emissions and the ever-earlier date of Earth Overshoot Day, when our resource consumption exceeds the planet's capacity to regenerate those resources. And we've had a very, very long time to make the changes. And if we had made them earlier, they would have been much less radical and much less difficult. Whole generations have chosen not to address this looming climate and ecological catastrophe. They've chosen to do this. They've opted instead to burn ever more fossil fuels and destroy ecosystems at an ever-increasing rate. They cannot claim not to have known. The risks of climate change and ecosystem collapse have been known about since the 1970s at least. Climate scientists testified before US Congress in the 1980s. In 1990, the UN Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases stated that beyond 1 degree Celsius may elicit rapid, unpredictable and non-linear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. Looks like they might have been right. In 2005, the UN commissioned Millennium Ecosystem Assessment sounded warnings about biodiversity loss and ecosystem destruction. We've had decades to do something about this. What about the UK? Aren't we a climate leader? We claim to be, but let's scrutinise our record a little bit more closely. David Cameron in 2013 is said to have said, we've got to get rid of all this green crap. He didn't deny the quote. Usually number 10 denies these things if they didn't say them. In 2014, the government went on to announce the biggest new road building scheme in decades. In 2015, it ended subsidies for onshore wind, and at the same time it expanded subsidies for oil and gas drilling worth billions of pounds. It scrapped zero carbon homes in 2016, it approved a new runway at Heathrow in 2017, it sold off the Green Investment Bank in the same year. World-leading carbon emissions reductions since 1990, there's world leadings in quotes there, they've been achieved largely as a result of a declining industry, manufacturing industry, and as a result of switching from one fossil fuel, coal, to another, gas. And they don't take into account shipping, aviation, or imported emissions anyway. The UK Committee on Climate Change, in its 2018 report to Parliament, said that the UK is not on track to meet its 2 degrees Celsius commitments. The Parliament's declaration of a climate emergency has so far resulted in no change in policy. We're still above the global average in per capita emissions. Just the other day, of course, Theresa May committed to legislate net zero emissions by 2050, which is a welcome step, but it's nowhere near enough in light of what we've seen. The proposed legislation in this case includes a get-out clause after 5 years. It doesn't deal with aviation or shipping, and it uses international carbon credits to offset emissions, which is contrary to the prescriptions of the UK's own Committee on Climate Change, Parliament's own Committee on Climate Change. And there's been no rollback of the disastrous policies that I've just been describing, and there's been no serious commitment to radical transformation of the policy. And it remains true, despite May's commitment, that we're not on track to meet our much nearer term, legally binding 4th and 5th carbon budgets according to the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change. And meanwhile, on the ecosystem front, we've just learned that the UK government is weakening pesticide regulation as it incorporates current EU law into UK law in preparation for Brexit. Extinction Rebellion calls for an end to this mendacity. The government must tell the truth on the climate and on the ecological crisis, and it must act to address it. It must declare a climate and ecological emergency, working with other institutions to communicate the scientific evidence and the urgency of the need for change. Note that governments conduct successful public health campaigns all the time based on scientific evidence. They did this on smoking, they've done this on seatbelts. We're calling for a similar approach, not shying away from the truth, and for using accurate or the best information we have to explain what we're facing as part of bringing about mass behaviour change. We're also calling for the government to act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. Now, of course, this is ambitious. The IPCC says that preventing a rise of much more than 1.5 degrees Celsius would require net zero by 2050. But we know that this leaves out the risks associated with ecosystem collapse and a bunch of feedback loops, and it relies on untested technologies and on bioenergy and carbon capture storage. A 2050 net zero target alone takes huge risks, the kinds of risks that you wouldn't even contemplate, even with much less at stake, right? So suppose you have a job interview. You're going for a job interview, the train you need to catch leaves at 20:20, you've got to get a bus to catch the train. No, 20:20, that's rather late for a job interview. It leaves at 9:20 in the morning. You look at the bus timetables, you see a bus that gets in at 9:17. This is just for your job. Of course you don't take that bus, right? You find an earlier bus. But with much, much larger risks at stake, existential risks at stake, we're taking risks, comparable risks. But you might say, come on, isn't this politically impossible? And this brings me to Extinction Rebellion's third demand. In our rather dysfunctional democracy, it's rather difficult to address this crisis through standard democratic procedures. These things that should not be party political become politicised, as I'm sure you've seen. So Extinction Rebellion calls for a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological action, and government to create such an assembly and to be guided by its decisions. The Citizens' Assembly that Extinction Rebellion calls for uses a process called sortition, which randomly selects people a little as we select juries. And these people form assemblies, and they make decisions on the basis of informed, fair, in an informed, fair and thoughtful setting. They're informed by researchers who are not allowed to give policy prescriptions, they're just allowed to give information. They're forced to disclose their funding when they do so. Members of the Citizens' Assembly would receive a proportionate impression of the scientific views on climate change, and it would learn about policies in detail before it decided. I'm not going to talk very much about sortition at the moment. You can look up the Sortition Foundation that Extinction Rebellion works with. I've got some great podcasts and videos about it. There are several reasons why a Citizens' Assembly would be helpful in the context of the ecological crisis. It gets away from party politics and the short-term the election cycle thinking associated with that. It gets away from lobbying and corruption of the power, corruption of the power that governments have by, for example, carbon-heavy companies. And crucially, citizens' assemblies have proved in the past to be efficient means of addressing issues that have been regarded as too toxic for conventional politics. So notably, they were used in decisions relating to gay marriage and abortion in Ireland, and relating to nuclear waste in New South Wales. So, how does Extinction Rebellion propose to achieve any of this? Well, our means are not those of ordinary politics, because ordinary politics have proved inadequate to the distinctive emergency that we face. Awareness, of course, has been raised for a very, very long time, since the 1970s indeed. But here we are, with emissions rising, biodiversity loss accelerating, and so on. Consumer choice, that's not effective. We've got to a point where a very small minority of people are buying biodegradable toothbrushes. There's a bit of a trend for veganism and meat-free Mondays here and there. It's nowhere near enough, it's not going to be near enough, and it's not going to be fast enough. Legal challenges, they've not been effective. The courts have ruled against the charity Plan B and actions aimed at forcing the UK government to align its policies with its own commitments. Okay, and even successful court actions against the government have not seen any serious change as a result. So, for example, the UK government has lost in the Supreme Court, I think, on its clean air strategy 3 times. Client Earth has taken it to court 3 times and it's won every time, and every time the result has not been to deal with the pollution that Client Earth was suing over. Elections, leafleting, letters to MPs, marches, and all of these other actions, they have not been effective either. The UK electoral system, of course, penalises small parties like the Green Party. So, for example, in 2015, the Green Party had 3.6% of the total vote, but it had 0.002% of the seats. Meanwhile, the Conservatives had 36.9% of the vote. They had more than 50% of the seats. Precisely because we all know this, people don't vote Green, even if they would otherwise. So even people, the Green votes look wasted, so even people who care about this don't vote for Greens. And there, of course, have been many climate marches and protests. You've probably not heard of most of them because they've received virtually no coverage whatsoever. The conclusion is that these approaches are not appropriate for the existential emergencies on the scale of the climate and ecosystem crisis that we face. And this is not only because they are ineffective against powerful interests, it's also because they send the message that the issue isn't actually that urgent. If somebody thinks that you can proportionately address the crisis that we face by handing out leaflets alone, then the message somebody receiving that leaflet is going to take is, the amount of effort that's required to deal with this is about level with the handing out of a leaflet for a bit. So it can't be that bad. Extinction Rebellion believes that the only viable response to government inaction in the face of climate and ecosystem emergency is rebellion. Not revolution, but strategic, non-violent, direct action. That's a system of resistance that is based upon the assumption that hierarchical systems can be radically transformed by the withdrawal of submission, cooperation, and obedience. It aims at sustained pressure derived from mass mobilization that withdraws a regime's economic, political, social, and in some cases, hopefully not this one, military support from domestic populations and third parties. Strategic non-direct action is not punching people in the street. It's respectful. Non-violence isn't just a matter of not hitting people either. It's not just a matter of mere passivity either. It's more than that. Opponents are treated with respect as fellow citizens, which is what they are, with whom we want to join to bring about the changes that are needed. This is partly a moral choice, but it's also partly a pragmatic choice. It's harder to demonize respectful protesters, and sympathy for them and their cause comes easier as a result. You might have noticed this during the protest that the police, they protested when Sajid Javid said that they should come down on protesters with more force. They said it's very difficult to do this because they're not doing anything much wrong. They're very nice. Strategic non-violent direct action is nevertheless disruptive. The problem with many protests is that they're very beautiful, and they're often very large. You might remember the Iraq War protests, but nobody takes any notice of them because you can just walk on by and it'll be gone the following day. What's needed is disruption of major cities, major systems, to get the attention of the public and the media in a short space of time, followed by the attention of political decision makers. It has to force them to stop business as usual. Otherwise, what we will get is business as usual. Of course, this gives rise to tactical dilemmas, and many of us inside XR are preoccupied with these a lot of the time. How much disruption is compatible with keeping the public on side, while being disruptive enough not just to be dismissed and ignored? There's no simple answer to that question. Extinction Rebellion's favoured kind of disruption is low-level mass action, requiring no special skills or equipment for the most part, or getting to difficult sites very far away. Unlike, for example, the Greenpeace protests against the drilling in the Arctic. It's economic disruption primarily, mass economic disruption. Strategic non-violent direct action is sacrificial. Disruption that doesn't cost the disruptor anything, doesn't elicit sympathy. It looks like troublemaking for the fun of it. If you engage in sacrifice, by contrast, e.g., for example, by strikes or by going to prison, you demonstrate the moral seriousness that you have, that you bring to the issue. You demonstrate that to the public and to the decision makers, which is much more likely to prompt sympathy and to point to the justice of your cause. Some strategic non-violent direct action, if you're lucky, in a rather double-edged sense of lucky, creates a backfiring response. So a good example of this is the Frack 3 incident. There's a fracking site, as you probably know, by Preston, in Blackpool, where people have been blocking the building site and getting arrested for more than a year now, with virtually no attention from anyone. But then recently 4 activists hijacked lorries that went into the fracking site, and they stayed on those lorries for 4 days and nights. Those activists were given a prison sentence, and that provoked an outcry, not just from environmentalists, but from non-environmentalists too. And now there's much greater media coverage and sympathy for them and their cause. Even if people don't really approve of your methods and aren't all that engaged with your cause, they're not going to approve of punishment which seems unjust, cruel, or disproportionate. So that's what we mean by rebelling. Not revolution, but rebelling. Is it appropriate? Well, it belongs to a proud tradition that includes Gandhi, Cory Aquino, and Martin Luther King. People in this tradition have stood up for what's right, even in the face of tremendous personal cost, and without the easy emotional attractions of contempt for their opponents and violence. Those are easy draws. They're very tempting, right, to think that your opponents are evil. But to engage with them respectfully, to protest respectfully, that's difficult. And to do that at great personal cost, that's difficult. Note the people that you probably really admire and are inspired by that, the suffragists, they were violent. They blew things up. Here's an example, the Freedom Riders from 1961. These were people who deliberately broke down the segregated bus policy by sitting where they weren't supposed to. It started with just 13 people, but it ended with around 400 who participated in several rides. And the protests sparked extremely violent responses which shocked the American public and elicited public sympathy and approval for the Freedom Riders, not for the backlash. In summer in 1961, slightly fewer than 400 Freedom Riders went to prison. They chose to go to prison rather than accept bail in order to clog up prison and in order to show again the seriousness of their commitment. And these weren't good prison conditions. After less than a year, these activities resulted in change, so that people could sit wherever they wanted on buses and trains. The existing non-segregation laws began to be enforced. So I've told you these demands, the XR demands, and I've told you, or I've shown you that there are some historical examples of this kind of actions being successful. And there are many other examples. But you still might wonder, is this going to work for climate breakdown here now? Well, arguably, the success of Extinction Rebellion's non-violent direct action is going to depend on mass participation. But mass participation need not mean most of the population's participation. So Erica Chenoweth, with Maria Stephan, has done research collecting data on all major non-violent and violent campaigns globally since 1900. That's 323 uprisings. And their analysis, finds that non-violent campaigns worldwide were twice as likely to succeed outright as violent ones. And this trend's been increasing over time. They also found that you don't need everyone by a long way. You don't need 75% of the population, you don't need 50% of the population, you don't even need 10% of the population. The magic number, every non-violent campaign that attained 3.5% population participation succeeded. So that's not to say if you hit that amount it will happen, nor is it to say that's a necessary condition of its happening, but it's to show you that this does not need, you do not need to persuade up 100% of the population. You do not need 65 million people on the streets for this to succeed. But how many people you need depends to some degree on the type of action that they engage in. What we need is people to join this proud tradition of resistance, not to hope that others will take care of the problem, not to hope that they'll be all right even as others burn, not to hope, but to stand up for what's right as political mechanisms prove inadequate. What we need is for people to rebel for life. And in light of the need for visibly sacrificial non-violent disruption, arrestability is a key part of the Extinction Rebellion strategy. We need people to rise up against climate breakdown and ecological collapse and the systems that are producing them, and civil disobedience, arrestable civil disobedience, is a core component of that. But around the arrestees, Extinction Rebellion needs a great deal more. Although hundreds have been arrested for acts of peaceful, non-violent civil disobedience, thousands more have been there providing essential support to them. Non-arrestable protesters, welfare supporters, legal observers, providers of food and tents and infrastructure at protests, legal representatives for those arrested, behind-the-scenes administrators, accommodation providers. Extinction Rebellion needs and recognises and welcomes every contribution from everyone who's something to give in the fight against the looming catastrophe. And we recognise that not everyone is in a position to be able to offer themselves for arrest. Not everyone can trust either that they'll get this basically respectful treatment by police that XR arrestees have mostly so far reported. But almost everyone can offer some form of support, which is not just tacitly sitting there and hoping that the other people will do the job for you. Finally, to my own specialism, breaking the law. Isn't breaking the law wrong? Well, in the face of a crisis on the scale that we face, almost every political philosophy returns the answer that no, it is not wrong. Socialist political theorists saw the problem of ecosystem destruction a long time ago. They argue that contemporary political systems are delegitimized by, among other things, the damaging exploitation of nature that they engender. Liberal political theorists argue that political authorities' legitimacy is conditional upon their securing liberty, security, the common good, or justice. Conservative political theorists argue that political authorities' legitimacy derives from their capacity to secure peace, order, or long-standing or traditional values, institutions, or ways of life. Climate change and ecosystem collapse pose a grave and immediate threat to peace, order, security, the common good, liberty, justice, and traditional ways of life, values, and institutions. From almost any political perspective, Extinction Rebellion's strategy of non-violent civil disobedience is a necessary and proportionate response to the climate and ecological emergency. Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, was acquitted of all charges in May 2019 after making this argument by a jury. From the moral perspective, non-violent civil disobedience is clearly a proportionate response to the climate and ecological breakdown. Remember, we're on track for 4 degrees Celsius or more of global warming by 2100. That means hundreds of millions of people without water and food, facing flooding, drought, wildfires, deadly heat waves, rising sea levels, and storms. That means massive global political destabilization and migration crises. That means complete and irreversible destruction of key ecosystems and species and mass extinctions. And this is not taking into account the contributions of ecosystem destruction and biodiversity loss and a range of possible feedback loops. In that context, you might think that the question is not whether breaking the law is wrong, but whether standing by and hoping that others will take care of this for you is morally acceptable. There's also this question. Our political, our legal, our economic systems, they are blocking efforts to address this crisis. Many of you know me, I'm basically pretty conservative. I have my doubts about all of this. I have my doubts about Extinction Rebellion's tactics. What I want to do is stay home, come to work, do some research, have a nice glass of wine, go to school's dinner. I have my doubts about their tactics and their messaging, and I still do. No mass movement can please all of its members all of the time. People will do things in the name of Extinction Rebellion that I don't think are appropriate. They're going to do that, there's no avoiding it. But I've been inspired by the courage of many of the participants to stand up and be counted in what is, as far as I can see, our only hope of living up to the challenge from future generations and millions of our contemporaries and averting climate and ecological disaster. I've come to think that I will not be able to look my children in the eye, or look your children in the eye, knowing what I now know, and say that I didn't join a non-violent, respectful rebellion because I had a couple of doubts about some of the tactics, or because I hoped that technology or billionaires would fix everything, because I thought that there was still a bit of time. What am I going to say to them? I voted Green. I tried not to fly too much. I didn't eat much meat. These things are not enough. We need people, we need you, we need me, to stand up and resist. We need to stand together, shoulder to shoulder, against the powerful interests and systems whose short-termism threatens us all. After hearing all of the stuff in the first half of this talk, it's quite natural to despair. Even if we do everything we can now, a great deal of warming is already locked in. Climate change is already ruining lives, and a great many ecosystems are lost. A great many species are extinct. Your children will not know the world that humans have inhabited for millennia. As Kate Marvel says, we are the lucky ones who suffer little tragedies, unmoored from the brutality of history. But that's not going to be true for our descendants. So in response to the despair that one might feel in recognition of this, let me finish by quoting some other words first. She says, as a climate scientist, I'm often asked to talk about hope. Climate change is bleak, the organisers always say. Tell us a happy story, give us hope. The problem is I don't have any. But the opposite of hope is not despair, it is grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn. What we need is courage, not hope. We need the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. Thanks so much.